Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So many moons ago I made a video talking about where medieval people purchased their swords. So this topic has been kind of covered before and probably more in depth than I'm going to do here. But I get comments on old videos because obviously those videos are up for eons on YouTube and they do still attract comments occasionally. And I had a comment, I'm not going to say the person's name or anything like that, but it was a sort of smug comment going like, they'd obviously watched like, I don't know, like 30 seconds or less of the video and just gone, a blacksmith, obviously. Now, and that's a paraphrase. Now, this is a massive misconception, I think, that people have of medieval times. And it's part and parcel of the fact that I think that due to maybe video games, role-playing games, TV shows, movies, this kind of stuff, I think there's an oversimplification in people's minds of medieval society, industry, technology, and everything else. And people, as you will have experienced in many video games, as I'm sure, certainly I've seen in several, some which should have known better as well, someone will go and go to get a sword, either buy a sword or have a sword made from a common village blacksmith. Now, I'm not going to say that this never happened in the medieval period, but I think it would be very much the exception rather than the norm. The headline here is that blacksmiths in the medieval period, certainly by the middle of what we'd call the Middle Ages, so the typical sort of, between the Norman conquest, between 1000 AD and basically about 1500 AD and beyond that, blacksmiths for the most part were people who made horseshoes, maybe, door hinges, things like this. They made random, for the most part, wrought iron, things that would be in everyday use and were of relatively low value. Now, of course, that's not to say that there are not a variety within blacksmiths. There would have been blacksmiths who were specialised for making things to do with barrels or wheels, ones that are making stuff to do with horses, stuff to do with architectural details, this kind of thing. So there would have been some specialism. And then there would have been the kind of almost like the handyman type blacksmith in a village who basically just did a bit of everything. But for the most part, none of those would have been sword makers. And there were several reasons for that. Number one, there were specific sword makers in the medieval period, and there was an industry, an entire industry, arms and arm industry for making weapons and armour. And those things were made of high quality steel, which wasn't necessarily easily available actually to the type of people, who were just like a village blacksmith. So they made a high quality steel, and it has to be said that an awful lot of blades, much like later in the 18th and 19th century, a lot of blades in medieval Europe were made in specific blade making centres, the kind of medieval equivalent of a factory actually. And they were exported out from there, and it was a very structured industry, and it was also tied into guild systems as well. And that's something that I think a lot of people who have a casual interest in the medieval period, who maybe watch medieval-ish themed TV shows or play medieval type of video games or do role-playing games, they don't necessarily know very much about how guild systems worked in Europe. Now, I'm not an expert on guild systems, and it can get incredibly in-depth and incredibly complicated. If you want to learn more about medieval guilds, go and read a book about medieval guilds, or at least, just search on the internet and read a bit more. I'm not an expert on that stuff. But the fact is that in any country or state, there were knife-making guilds, sword-making guilds, helmet-making guilds, as well as all the other things not related to weapons, of course, stuff to do with tailors' guilds and silver-making guilds and all of this kind of stuff. So the fact is that the manufacture of swords as a whole, and I'll break that down in a second because they're not all necessarily made by one person or place, but the manufacture of swords was extremely complexly structured, but also regulated as well. And so Unfortunately, you know, people have a kind of a Conan the Barbarian view of medieval Europe, but it just simply wasn't like that. It was basically an early modern world where there were advanced tax systems in place. For example, any foreign merchants coming into the port of London in the 15th century had to pay a tax in order to sell their wares in London, and very often that tax was taken in the form of bow staves. So anyone who has an interest in medieval English archery and longbows will probably know that a lot of English longbows were actually made of bow staves which came from places like Italy, northern Italy for the most part, alpine regions, and they were used as essentially tax payments for foreign merchants coming into London to be able to have the right to sell their wares there. So it was actually a very economically developed and complex world, and swords were part of that. Sword manufacture were part of that. Now, I mentioned a few centres that swords were made in. There are several famous ones that remain to this day. You know, Solingen, for example, is still a knife-making centre today, and throughout the 19th century, Solingen was a major manufactory of swords that were exported all over Europe and to America and South America as well. But it had its roots in medieval sword-making and knife-making worlds. But equally, there were other famous places like Toledo, Milan in Italy made quite a lot of swords. There's a place described as Bordeaux in France, and this causes some debate because people don't know whether it's Bordeaux as in the famous city of Bordeaux, which was English for 300 years, we have to mention, or whether it's somewhere else with the same name. There's some ambiguity about that. But basically, there were certain places, and there weren't a huge number of them, but there were certain places throughout medieval Europe that were incredibly developed at making sword blades because it's a very specialised industry. Bringing this full circle, because this is where it connects, a typical village blacksmith could not in the 15th century, for the most part, make a sword that would be respected in 15th century Europe. So that's not to say that a typical blacksmith who normally makes horseshoes and hinges and barrel bands and things like this, is not to say that they couldn't make a functional weapon. Of course they could certainly make axes and warhammers and stuff like that. They could make a sword, but let's think about this in the modern world for a minute. Let's talk about motorbikes, okay? So someone who works in their garage like this, who maybe fixes up bikes and cars and has some understanding of how they're made, if you said to them, I want you to make me a motorbike from scratch, not using, you know, parts, not like assembling, you know, not using bits of Suzuki's and BMW's and other, you know, Nortons, whatever, existing motorbikes or Harley Davidson, putting them together into a bike. No, I want you to make it from scratch. I want you to make the springs. I want you to make the engine block. I want you to make the exhaust system, everything. I want you to make it yourself. Now, obviously, modern motoring machines are a somewhat unfair comparison because they're much more complex than swords are. But I think this comparison kind of stands up. They could do it, okay? So long as they had the equipment and the know-how, they could build a motorbike. But now imagine the end result of that motorbike. For the most part, it is not going to be on a par with a factory-produced motorbike by a company like Honda or Yamaha or whoever, who actually do that for their entire industry, and they have huge factories and experts and scientists and computers for testing the efficiency of everything. It's not going to be on a par with one of those machines, and that's kind of like sword manufacturing in the medieval world. Yes, a village blacksmith could make a sword that could possibly cut things and be used as a weapon, but it wouldn't be respected on the same level as a sword which had come from Toledo or Milan or Solingen, perhaps even London. There was some blade making in London, although far less illustrious, shall we say, certainly for swords. So the fact is that they could do it, but that doesn't mean that they really did do it, and it doesn't really mean that it happened much at all, and there are good reasons for that. Now, finally, I want to point out that because this industry was highly specialised, so again, if we look at the modern motor industry, we'll often see that there are parts sharing and there is specialisation between companies. So often a company will specialise, a factory will specialise in manufacturing one particular part, and then they will sell that part to lots of different companies. So we might find common parts, whether it's computer parts or engine parts or chassis parts, whatever, suspension. We might find common parts on a BMW, a Mercedes, a VW, a Jaguar. You might find that they share common parts, and they often do. And you know, a famous example is the BMW iDrive system, and that is used on several very high-end sports cars because BMW developed it. It works very well, so why reinvent the wheel? So, you know, I think maybe Lamborghini or one of those uses it. So the fact is that if you're specialized at something, there's very few other people who are going to be able to compete with you at that thing. And that was true of medieval sword producing as well. So as I've mentioned, the places I was talking about were primarily famous for blade manufacturing. However, when it comes to hilts, you have a whole different bunch of skills. There are some people, and some of them might be jewelers. They might not be traditionally weapon makers, but certainly if you want a high-end bejeweled pommel and guard, for example, or very detailed, if you're going to the 16th century, if you're looking at swept hilts that are decorated or cup hilts or whatever, decorated very high standard, and they may be fire gilded, they might have silver plate on them and this kind of thing, then that's kind of more the territory of jewelers. So very often what you find in the medieval world and Renaissance worlds, and in fact this goes through to the 19th century to some degree as well, is very often the people making the blades, the company or the factory making the blades, are not necessarily the people making the hilts. And we do know that in the medieval world it was not uncommon at all for blades to be exported bare. And in fact there are a couple of surviving examples. If you know Ewart Oakeshot's works, then in Records of the Medieval Sword there's an example of a very nice German-made two-handed sword blade or long sword blade, big one, probably 14th, might be 15th century if I remember correctly, and it has clearly never had a hilt put on it. And what this probably was an export blade that someone, a cutler who was intending to hilt it, just never got around to doing. It was put into storage, and hundreds of years later someone discovers it again. And the tangs are usually longer because obviously the person making the blade doesn't know what type of hilt the person is intending, the cutler or whoever is going to put the hilt on is intending to put on, so they leave the tangs longer. And remember, on medieval swords, unlike modern swords like this Albion here, on medieval swords the tangs tend to be iron or certainly unheat treated. So even if they're made of the same steel as the blade, it would only be quenched up to a certain point, and the tang would be relatively soft. So it's quite easy, in fact, to reshape that tang. It's quite easy to peen the tang. In some cases, if you need to make the tang longer, you could stretch it, but usually the tangs were made longer than they needed to be, so the person fitting the hilt could cut them down. So you would have people who were specialised in making hilt parts. You would have people who were specialised perhaps sometimes in making grips or grip coverings. Remember, you sometimes, even with these high-end Albions, these are cord and then leather, but in fact historically a lot of high-end swords had all sorts of materials on the grip, including silk wraps, special knotted things. Sometimes you even get stones, semi-precious stones embedded in the grip for more, not ornamental, but more kind of almost kind of ceremonial or kind of dress, full dress swords. So there were specialised grip makers. So there might be lots of different industries involved in making a sword. So, to conclude, the village blacksmith was not the person, certainly by the kind of 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, the medieval period that most people are kind of interested in and study, I would say. But even this is true if we go back into the kind of 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, so the kind of Viking and Norman eras. The people who made swords were specialist sword makers, and they were usually not the same people who made bills and halberds. They were usually not the same people that made arrowheads. They were usually not the same people that made armour. So unlike in video games or even role-playing games or even movies, you didn't just go to one person who could sell you horseshoes, swords and armour. These were separate industries and separate specialisms, separate people. And to reiterate once again, they were sometimes separate guilds, so they were even legally and in tax terms separate entities. Right, I hope that has been somewhat clarifying and interesting. Give this video a like if you thought this was at all interesting. Subscribe if you haven't done already, and hopefully I'll see you really soon again for another video on a similar or related topic. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!